It was the sort of October dusk that chilled the bone, warning of a hard winter ahead. The wind rattled the porch boards, and silence hung heavy over the struggling farm. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Standing there was a stranger, a weathered old man clutching two shivering German shepherd puppies against his chest like gold. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for food. He looked at Elsie with eyes full of shame and asked only for the barn. She had no idea that her reply would break his defenses, unearth a devastating secret he'd carried for years, and spark a miracle that would save them both. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The wind swept across the fallow fields, kicking up dust against the peeling siding of the farmhouse. Leaves skittered across the porch like dry bones. Elsie Whitaker stood by the railing, tightening her shawl against the encroaching chill. At 38, she wore her widowhood like armor, functional, heavy, and impenetrable. The lantern in her hand cast a flickering glow on a face that had learned that help rarely came when you truly needed it. She watched the lane, her eyes sharp. She was just about to turn inside, to the silence of a house that had felt too big for 3 years. Then, a shadow detached itself from the tree-line. Elsie stiffened, her hand gripping the cold metal of the lantern until her knuckles turned white. Strangers didn't walk this lane after dark. Not honest ones. She didn't reach for a weapon, but her posture became one, rigid and unyielding. "Ma'am?" The voice was cracked, dry as the autumn leaves but surprisingly gentle. The figure stepped into the pool of yellow light. He was older than she expected, 60s perhaps, wearing a coat that had seen better decades. But it was what he held against his chest that stopped her breath. Two tiny puppies, black and tan, whimpering against the cold. "We don't have money," Elsie said, her voice steel. The old man shook his head, his eyes watering in the wind. "I don't want money. Just the barn. Please. It's getting cold and they won't last the night." The October wind didn't just blow through the valley, it hunted. It rattled the loose siding of the farmhouse and hissed through the cracks in the window frames, seeking out any warmth left inside. Elsie Whitaker stood on her porch, wrapped in a wool cardigan that had seen better years, watching the daylight bleed out of the sky. 3 years. That was how long the silence had been the loudest thing in the house. Since the accident. The phone call, the siren, the terrible stillness of the tractor overturned in the south pasture. The farm had slowly begun to die along with her husband. The paint was peeling in long gray strips. The fences leaned drunkenly toward the earth, tired of holding back the world. Elsie rubbed her arms, feeling the chill settle deep in her joints. At 38 she felt 80. Her children, David and Sarah, had fled to the city years ago, chasing lives that didn't involve dirt under their fingernails or the constant, crushing anxiety of harvest margins. She didn't blame them, but on nights like this, when the darkness pressed against the glass, the solitude felt physical, like a weight on her chest. She reached for the door handle, ready to retreat into the kitchen where a single bowl of soup waited, cold and unappealing. Then came the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of gravel under boots. Slow, dragging steps. Elsie froze. Her hand dropped from the latch to her side, fingers curling into a fist. Neighbors didn't walk this far out, not after dusk and certainly not in this weather. She squinted into the gloom, her heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against her ribs. She was a woman alone, miles from town, with nothing but a rusted shotgun upstairs that she hadn't fired since the funeral. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. A shape detached itself from the shadows of the old oak tree near the driveway. It was a man. Even in the failing light, she could see he was old, stooped, favoring his left leg, his silhouette jagged with layers of ragged clothing. He stopped at the edge of the porch light, as if afraid the brightness might burn him. Elsie stiffened, her posture rigid. "I don't keep cash in the house," she warned, the lie coming easily. "And the sheriff makes a round past here in 20 minutes. The man stepped forward and the light caught his face. He was bearded, the gray hair matted and wild, his face a map of deep fissures carved by sun and sorrow. He looked like a piece of the landscape that had broken off and drifted to her doorstep. But it wasn't his face that held her gaze. It was his arms. He was clutching a dirty woolen bundle against his chest, shielding it from the biting wind with his own body. He looked up at her, and Elsie was struck by the clarity of his eyes. They weren't the glassy, vacant eyes of the drunks she sometimes saw near the train tracks in town. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a desperate, crushing humiliation. "I apologize for the intrusion, ma'am," he said. His voice was raspy, dry as dead leaves, but the diction was precise. Educated. It didn't match the duct tape on his boots or the grime on his coat. "I saw the light. I wouldn't have stopped, but—" He looked down at his chest. A small, high-pitched whimper cut through the sound of the wind. The man pulled back the edge of the wool blanket. Two tiny heads popped up, German Shepherd puppies no bigger than her hand. One black and tan, the other a dusty cream. They were shivering so violently their teeth chattered, their dark eyes wide with terror and cold. "They're freezing," the man said, and his voice cracked, losing its polished edge. "I've been walking since morning. I can take the cold, but they're too small. They won't make it through the night out here." Elsie stared at the puppies. They looked skeletal, their ribs pushing against damp fur. The black one let out a sneeze that sounded like a dry click. "I'm not asking for money," the man continued, seeing her hesitation. He shifted his weight, wincing as his bad leg protested. "I'm not asking to come inside your house. I know how I look. I know what you must think." He gestured vaguely toward the dark, looming shape of the barn across the yard. "Just the barn. Please. Just a corner out of the wind. We'll be gone before you wake." Elsie looked from the man to the barn, then back to the shivering creatures in his arms. Her mind raced with every warning her son David had given her. "You're too trusting, Mom. People take advantage. A widow alone is a target." Logic told her to tell him to keep moving. The barn was full of equipment she couldn't afford to replace. He was a stranger. He could be anyone. But then the man looked down at the puppies again and she saw him shiver, not from the cold but from the effort of holding himself upright. He was exhausted. He was starving. And yet he was begging for the dogs, not himself. She saw the tractor in the barn shadows, the one her husband had died on. She remembered the silence of the house. She remembered what it felt like to be cold and to feel like no one was coming to help. Elsie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "The barn roof leaks on the east side," she said, her voice dropping its hard edge. "Stay to the left near the stalls. There's dry straw there." The man slumped, as if the strings holding him up had been cut. For a second she thought he might fall. He closed his eyes, exhaling a shuddering breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." "Wait here," she commanded. Elsie turned and went inside. She moved with a sudden, frantic energy. She grabbed the pot of vegetable soup from the stove. It was still warm. She took a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and 3 old blankets from the hall closet. When she returned to the porch, he hadn't moved. He was murmuring softly to the bundle in his arms, his rough hands stroking the puppies' heads with heartbreaking tenderness. "Here," she said, setting the items on the porch railing. "There's a lantern in the barn hanging by the door. Matches are in the tin on the shelf. Don't burn my barn down." The man looked at the food, then at her. He seemed to struggle with his pride, a visible war fought in the set of his jaw. Hunger won. He stepped forward and took the blankets first, immediately wrapping them tighter around the dogs. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, meeting her eyes. "I didn't ask for payment," Elsie replied, crossing her arms to ward off the chill. "Just keep them alive." He nodded solemnly. "Gus and Gracie," he said, looking down at them. "That's their names. And I'm Walter." "Go on, Walter," Elsie said, nodding toward the barn. "Before the wind gets worse." She watched him limp across the yard, his figure swallowed by the darkness until the faint glow of the barn lantern flickered to life. She stayed on the porch for a long time watching that light. It was a small, fragile thing against the immense darkness of the farm, but it was there. An hour later, unable to settle, Elsie pulled her boots back on. She told herself she was just checking the locks on the exterior doors, ensuring the equipment was safe. She walked quietly to the barn door and peered through the slat. Inside, the lantern cast a warm, golden circle in the gloom. Walter had made a nest of straw and blankets in the corner. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting with his back against the wooden stall, feeding the puppies bits of bread soaked in the soup, letting them lick it from his fingers. He spoke to them in a low, soothing hum, a lullaby of nonsense words. He took a bite of the bread himself, chewing slowly, his eyes closed in what looked like prayer. Elsie felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest, a mixture of pity and something that felt dangerously like hope. She turned to leave, her boots scuffing the dirt. Walter's head snapped up. He saw her shadow through the slats. He didn't scramble or hide. He simply wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and called out, his voice steady despite his weariness. "Ma'am?" Elsie paused, caught. "I was just checking the latch," she lied through the wood. "I noticed the fence line is down near the creek. Walter said. His voice carried through the door, strong and clear. And that tractor. The carburetor sounds like it's clogged. I heard it sputtering in my head when I looked at it. Elsie stayed silent. I can fix it, Walter said. I'll start on the fence at first light. I'll earn my keep if you'll have me. Elsie stared at the rough wood of the barn door. He wasn't asking for charity anymore. He was offering a trade. Dignity for shelter. Get some sleep, Walter, she said softly. She walked back to the house, the wind no longer feeling quite so biting. But as she climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom, she glanced out the window one last time. The light in the barn was still on. And for the first time in 3 years, Elsie Whitaker wondered if the man down there was running from something, or if, by some strange twist of fate, he had been sent to stop her from running from herself. She pulled the curtains closed, unaware that in the morning, the man in the barn would do something that would make her question everything she thought she knew about him, and about the safety of her own home. Elsie woke to a silence that felt different. For 3 years, the morning quiet of the farm had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, the sound of emptiness. But this morning, the silence had a texture to it, a subtle undercurrent of something having changed. She sat up, the quilt pooling around her waist, and instinctually looked toward the window. The sunrise was a bruised purple bruising into pale gold, the frost on the glass catching the light. Memory rushed back in a cold wash. The knock, the old man, the puppies. She dressed quickly, pulling on her heavy denim work coat and shoving her feet into boots that were stiff with cold. Part of her, the part that had listened to her son David's warnings on repeat, expected to walk out and find the barn empty, the stranger gone, and her tools missing. It was the cynical expectation of a woman who had learned that the world rarely gave without taking. Elsie stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. She scanned the yard. The barn door was slid open just a crack. She crossed the gravel driveway, the frost crunching under her heels. She pushed the barn door open, bracing herself for the smell of unwashed bodies or the disarray of a squatter. Instead, she stopped dead in the doorway. The barn smelled of clean straw and pine oil. The center aisle, usually cluttered with wind-blown debris and scattered feed, was swept clean. The heavy stall doors, which had hung crooked on their hinges for months, were aligned perfectly. But it was the workbench against the far wall that stole the breath from her lungs. Her husband, Frank, had been a meticulous man. He had outlined his tools on a pegboard in black marker. Since his death, Elsie had used the tools sporadically, putting them back in the wrong places or leaving them in buckets, too tired to care about the order of things. Now, every wrench, every hammer, every pair of shears hung exactly within its black outline. The sight of it, the ghost of Frank's order restored by a stranger's hands, made her throat tight. "Morning, ma'am." Elsie spun around. Walter was coming in from the back pasture entrance. He was limping heavily on his left leg, his breath pluming in the cold air. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat. He was in a flannel shirt that was threadbare at the elbows, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were sinewy and scarred. He carried a roll of wire fencing over one shoulder. "You're up early," Elsie said, recovering her composure. She nodded at the workbench. "You didn't have to do that." "I couldn't sleep," Walter said simply. He set the wire down with a grunt of effort. "And I don't like being idle. A man pays for his shelter, one way or another." "You mucked the stalls," she noted. "And fixed the latch on the grain bin," he added. "Raccoons would have been in there by tonight if I hadn't." The wood was rotted through. Elsie looked at him. In the daylight, he looked even older than he had the night before. The lines around his eyes were deep trenches, and his beard was a tangled mix of iron and snow. But he stood straight, despite the bad leg. He stood like a man who was used to reporting for duty. "Where are they?" Elsie asked. Walter smiled then, a small breaking of the ice in his expression. He pointed to a horse blanket folded into a deep nest near the heater. "Sleepin' off the breakfast. They ate good. That soup broth saved them." Elsie walked over and peered into the nest. Gus and Gracie were curled into a yin-yang of black and tan fur, their bellies round and rising rhythmically. They looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the shivering, desperate creatures from the night before. "I made coffee," Elsie said, the offer hanging in the air like a truce. "It's on the stove. If you're done playing janitor, you can come up to the porch." Walter hesitated, looking down at his muddy boots. "I don't want to track dirt on your floor, ma'am." "It's a porch, Walter. It's seen dirt before. Come on." 10 minutes later, they sat on the wooden rockers that hadn't been used in tandem since Frank passed. Walter held the ceramic mug with both hands, letting the steam warm his face. He drank black, no sugar, taking small, appreciative sips. "This is good coffee," he murmured. "Best I've had in, well, a long time." "It's just Folgers," Elsie said, but she felt a strange prickle of pride. "So, you know about grain bins and fence wire? You aren't just a drifter." Walter looked out over the fields, his eyes tracking the line where the forest met the pasture. "Had a place once," he said quietly. "Nebraska. Corn and soy, mostly, little bit of cattle. A lifetime ago." The way he said it, "a lifetime ago," shut down any further questions. It wasn't a casual statement, it was a door closing. Elsie recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when people asked about Frank. "Why the puppies?" she asked instead. "Seems like a lot of baggage for a man on the road." Walter looked down into his coffee. "Found him in a box by the highway 3 days ago. Just left there. I walked past him at first. Told myself I couldn't keep myself alive, let alone 2 dogs. He paused, his jaw working. "Got about a mile down the road before I turned back. Couldn't leave him to the coyotes. Suppose we're all just looking for a pack to run with." Elsie looked at the man, this stranger who fixed latches and organized tools and turned back for abandoned dogs despite having nothing of his own. "I need help," Elsie said. The words came out before she could check them. Walter looked up, surprised. "The farm," she clarified, gesturing to the overgrown fields. "My husband died 3 years ago. My kids are in the city. I've been trying to keep it running, but the equipment is old and the bank is—" She stopped herself. She wasn't going to tell him about the foreclosure notices stuffed in the kitchen drawer. "It's too much for one person." Walter set his mug down on the railing. He looked at the tractor parked near the barn, the green paint faded, the engine silent. "I noticed the carburetor on the John Deere is shot," he said. "And your south fence is mostly suggestion at this point." "I can't pay you," Elsie said, her voice hard with the shame of it. "Not a wage. Not what you'd be worth." "I didn't ask for money," Walter said. He turned to her, his gaze intense and steady. "I need a place to sleep that isn't under a bridge. I need a place where those pups can grow up without freezing to death. You give me the barn and a meal a day and I'll give you everything I've got." Elsie looked at his hands. They were large, scarred, and trembling slightly, not from weakness she realized but from a need to be useful. He was a man who defined himself by his labor, and without it, he was vanishing. She thought of David, who would be furious. She thought of the town gossips. Then she looked at the fence line he had already started fixing, the wire pulled taut and professional. "The barn gets cold in December," Elsie said. "We'll have to put a heater in the tack room for the dogs." Walter nodded slowly. "I can rig something up safe. Won't be a fire hazard. And you eat dinner on the porch," she added. "I don't cook for one very well anyway." "Deal?" Walter said. He didn't offer his hand. He seemed to know that was too familiar too soon, but he dipped his chin in a respectful nod. Elsie stood up, taking her empty mug. "There's a toolbox in the shed behind the house. Has some specialty wrenches for that tractor. Frank, my husband, he hid them back there so he wouldn't lose them." Walter stood as well. "I'll find 'em. Thank you, Elsie." "Ma'am." "Elsie is fine." She watched him walk back toward the barn. His limp seemed less pronounced now, as if the prospect of work had oiled the rusted joints. He stopped at the barn door, whistled a low, sharp note, and the 2 puppies came tumbling out into the sunlight, barking with high-pitched enthusiasm. Walter knelt, and the hardened lines of his face dissolved as the dogs licked his chin. Elsie went back inside the quiet house. She walked to the kitchen window and watched him lift the hood of the tractor. He moved with the confidence of a surgeon. For the first time in years, the farm didn't look like a dying thing. It looked like something that was just holding its breath. But as she turned to rinse her mug in the sink, her eye caught something on the floor by the mudroom door, where Walter had stood the night before. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper that must have fallen from his pocket when he pulled out the blanket. Elsie bent down and picked it up. It was an old photograph, creased white down the middle and softened by years of handling. She smoothed it out on the counter. It showed a younger Walter, clean-shaven and smiling, standing next to a beautiful woman and a little girl in front of a sprawling, prosperous farmhouse. But it wasn't the happiness in the photo that made Elsie's blood run cold. It was what was written on the back in shaky, smeared ink, a date from 10 years ago and 3 chilling words that suggested Walter wasn't just a down-on-his-luck farmer, but a man running from a tragedy so deep it had swallowed his name. "Forgive me, Margaret." November arrived not with a whisper, but with a hard, gray frost that clamped down on the valley and refused to let go. In previous years, the onset of winter had sent Elsie into a spiral of anxiety. frozen pipes, drafty windows, and the crushing weight of isolation. But this year the cold was met with the roar of an engine. The John Deere, silent for 3 years, coughed to life on a Tuesday morning. The sound was so startlingly loud against the quiet of the farm that Elsie dropped her coffee mug in the sink, cracking the handle. She ran to the window to see black smoke chugging from the exhaust pipe and Walter sitting in the driver's seat, a look of intense, quiet satisfaction on his face. He wasn't smiling. Walter rarely smiled with his mouth, but his eyes were alive. As the weeks bled into one another, a new rhythm took hold of the farm. It was the rhythm of work, steady and uncomplaining. The south fence, once a sagging embarrassment, now stood taut and proud, the rotted posts replaced with cedar Walter had cut and stripped himself. The barn, previously a tomb for dust and memories, became a hub of activity. Elsie found herself watching him from the kitchen window more often than she cared to admit. He moved with a deceptive slowness. To the untrained eye, he looked like an old man pottering about. But Elsie, raised on this land, saw the efficiency in his economy of motion. He didn't waste energy. Every swing of the hammer counted. Every twist of the wrench was precise. One afternoon she found him in the orchard, wrapping the bases of her neglected apple trees with burlap. Gus and Gracie, now gangly balls of adolescent fur and oversized paws, were wrestling in the dry leaves nearby. At Walter's sharp, low whistle, they instantly froze, dropped to their bellies and waited. "I didn't know apple trees needed winter coats," Elsie said, stepping through the high grass. Walter didn't look up from his knot. "It ain't the cold that kills 'em mostly. It's the sun scald when the bark freezes and thaws too fast. And the rabbits." He patted the trunk of the tree as if it were a shoulder. "You gotta protect the roots. If the roots know they're safe, the tree sleeps better." He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked healthier than the scarecrow who had arrived weeks ago. The hollows in his cheeks had filled in slightly, thanks to Elsie's cooking, and his skin had weathered to a healthy bronze rather than a sickly gray. But the limp was still there, a hitch in his step that worsened when the pressure dropped. "You taught those dogs well?" Elsie nodded at the puppies. "Discipline is kindness," Walter said, his voice soft. "An obedient dog is a safe dog. They know the boundaries so they don't have to be afraid of the world." Elsie looked at him, sensing a double meaning. "And what about you, Walter? Do you know the boundaries?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know exactly where the line is, ma'am. I don't cross where I'm not invited." That evening, Elsie made a decision. For weeks, she had been bringing his dinner out to the porch on paper plates. A subtle barrier, a way of saying you are here but you are not of here. Tonight, she took down the heavy stoneware plates she used for Sunday dinners. She ladled the beef stew thick and hot, cut a generous slab of cornbread, and carried the tray out to the porch. The sun was setting in a blaze of winter orange. Walter was already there, sitting in the rocker, whittling a piece of driftwood. He stopped when he saw the plates. He noticed the difference immediately: the ceramic, the heavy silverware, the cloth napkin. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Thank you, Elsie," he said, his voice rougher than usual. They ate in a companionable silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons and the wind in the eaves. "Frank used to say this land was stubborn," Elsie said, breaking the quiet. "Said it only gave back exactly what you put in and not a penny more." Walter nodded slowly. "Soil has a memory. You treat it greedy, it turns stingy. You treat it with respect, it'll hold you up." He paused, looking out over the darkening fields. "I knew a man in Nebraska. He tried to force the land. Went heavy on the chemicals, ignored the rotation. Lost 300 acres in 2 years. The earth just quit on him." Elsie watched him over the rim of her glass. "Is that what happened to you, Walter? Did the earth quit on you?" He froze, his spoon hovering halfway to his mouth. The air on the porch seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The earth didn't quit," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "The man did. Some things you can fix with a wrench or a plow. Some things, you break him so bad there's no putting him back together." He set his plate down, finished. He never drank alcohol. Elsie had offered him a beer once, early on, and he had looked at the bottle like it was a venomous snake before politely declining. Now, thinking of the photo she had found, "Forgive me, Margaret," she understood that his sobriety was a penance. Later that night, the wind picked up, howling down from the north. Elsie lay in bed reading when she heard it. A cry from the barn. It wasn't a cry of pain but of terror. A shout that ripped through the darkness. "No, Margaret, no." Elsie went to the window. The barn was dark, but she could see the faint movement of the lantern swinging as someone paced. Walter was awake. He was fighting ghosts that no amount of fencing or tractor repair could keep out. The next morning, Walter looked exhausted, the shadows back under his eyes. But he was already working, repairing the stone wall near the garden. Elsie brought him a thermos of coffee. "The barn is warm enough," she said, leaning against the gate. "The heater you rigged works well." "It's fine," Walter grunted, not looking up. "It doesn't feel like a barn anymore," Elsie said softly. "When I look out there now, it feels like someone's home." Walter stopped working. He rested his hands on the cold stone, his head bowed. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant cawing of a crow. "It's been a long time since I had a home," he whispered. "I'm not sure I remember how to be in one." "You're doing all right," Elsie said. "The farm looks better than it has since Frank died. You saved it, Walter." He turned to her then, and for the first time she saw water in his eyes. "You gave me a place to lay my head, Elsie. You didn't ask questions. You just opened the door. That's more than I deserve." "We all need saving sometimes," she replied. "Even if it's just from the quiet." They stood there for a moment, two broken people standing amidst the mended fences, finding a fragile peace in the company of one another. The trust between them felt solid now, built brick by brick, chore by chore. Elsie felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. She turned to head back to the house, a rare smile touching her lips. She was planning the menu for Thanksgiving, wondering if Walter would agree to eat inside at the table. Then she heard the sound. It was the crunch of gravel. Not the slow, rhythmic footsteps of Walter, but the aggressive, fast approach of tires. Elsie froze. She turned toward the driveway. A sleek, silver sedan was nosing its way up the lane, moving too fast for the potholes. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't the mailman. Walter stiffened, his posture instantly shifting from farmer back to soldier. He sensed the threat before he saw the driver. The car skid to a halt near the porch. The driver's door flew open and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a sharp city coat, his face tight with anger. Elsie's stomach dropped. It was her son David. And he was staring directly at Walter with a look that promised war. "Mom?" David shouted, slamming the car door. "What the hell is going on? Why did Mrs. Chin tell me you have a squatter living on Dad's land?" The silence that had settled comfortably over the farm for the past few weeks didn't just break, it shattered. David stood by the hood of his silver sedan, his breath coming in sharp, angry plumes. At 39 he was the spitting image of his father, but without Frank's softness. David was all angles and expensive wool, a man who measured life in quarterly returns and risk assessments. Behind him, pulling up in a more modest SUV, was Sarah. She stepped out, her face pinched with the specific anxiety of a daughter who spent her nights worrying about her widowed mother living miles from civilization. Elsie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped off the porch, her heart doing a nervous flutter against her ribs. She felt suddenly small, like a child caught breaking a rule, rather than the woman who owned the land they were standing on. "David, Sarah," Elsie said, forcing a smile. "I wasn't expecting you until noon." "Mrs. Chin called me, Mom," David said, his voice tight. He didn't move to hug her. His finger pointed like a weapon toward the barn, where Walter was quietly stacking the firewood he had spent the morning splitting. "She said you've got a man living in Dad's barn. Tell me she's crazy." Walter stopped moving. He didn't look over, but Elsie saw his shoulders tense. He slowly set down a log, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, like an animal trying not to trigger a predator. "His name is Walter," Elsie said, keeping her voice steady. "And he is helping me." "Helping you?" David laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "He looks like he walked out of a homeless shelter. Mom, look at him. He's a drifter. You let a strange man, a vagrant, sleep 50 yards from your bedroom window?" "He's not a vagrant," Elsie snapped, a flash of anger cutting through her anxiety. "He fixed the south fence. He got the tractor running. He's done more in 3 weeks than the two of you have done in 3 years." The words hung in the cold air, stinging. Sarah stepped forward, playing the peacemaker, though her eyes darted nervously toward Walter. "Mom, we just worry. You're out here all alone. You don't know who this person is. He could be anyone. He could be dangerous." "I invited him for Sunday dinner," Elsie said, turning back toward the house. "And if you want to eat, you'll be polite." The meal was a disaster from the moment they sat down. The dining room, usually warm and smelling of pot roast, felt like a courtroom. Walter had washed up at the pump outside. He had combed his hair and put on the clean flannel shirt Elsie had found in Frank's old trunk. He sat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid, his hands folded in his lap. He looked small in the presence of David's aggressive corporate energy. "So, Walter," David started, not bothering to pick up his fork. "Where are you from?" "Nebraska originally," Walter said quietly. "And what brings you to our neck of the woods?" David pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Just passing through? Or did you run out of road?" "David," Sarah warned softly. "I'm just asking," David said, leaning back. "It's a fair question. My mother is a generous woman, Walter. Sometimes too generous. I'd hate to see anyone take advantage of that." Walter looked up. His eyes met David's, and for a second the steel returned to his gaze, the look of the soldier he had once been. "I'm not taking anything I haven't earned, son. Your mother gave me shelter. I give her labor. It's a fair trade." "And what happens when winter really hits?" David challenged. "You just going to squat there indefinitely? What's your plan? Or is the plan just to leech off a widow until the well runs dry?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elsie slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "That is enough, David." Walter stood up slowly. He hadn't touched his food. His face was pale, his jaw set in a line of painful dignity. "I think I'll take my plate to the barn, Elsie," he said. His voice was calm, but it broke her heart. "The pups get anxious if I'm gone too long." "Walter, sit down," Elsie pleaded. "You are a guest." "No, ma'am," Walter said gently. "I'm the help. It's best we don't confuse the two." He picked up his plate and walked out the back door, his limp pronounced in the silence. The door clicked shut, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward to volatile. "How could you?" Elsie hissed at her son. "I'm doing what needs to be done." David exploded. He stood up and began pacing the small kitchen. "Mom, look at this objectively. You are a single woman in her 60s. You have a homeless man with a sob story living on your property. Do you know his background? Do you know if he has a criminal record? He could kill you in your sleep and nobody would find you for a week." "He's a good man," Elsie insisted, though her voice wavered under the barrage. "He's gentle. He's kind." "Ted Bundy was charming too," David shot back. "This is insane. I'm not leaving here until he's gone. I'll call the sheriff myself if I have to." "You will do no such thing. Then you need to come to reality." David walked over to the kitchen counter, looking for something to do with his hands. He yanked open the junk drawer, looking for a napkin or a pen, but his hand froze. Elsie's breath hitched. She had meant to move them. David reached into the drawer and pulled out a stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band. They weren't casual mail. They were white envelopes with red stamps. "Past due. Final notice." And on the bottom, the thick, heavy envelope from the bank. "David, don't," Elsie whispered. He ripped the bank envelope open. His eyes scanned the paper, widening in shock. $18,000? David's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. He looked up at her, the paper trembling in his hand. "Mom, you're $18,000 behind? And there's a foreclosure warning? 60 days? Sarah gasped, covering her mouth. "Mom? Is that true?" Elsie sank into her chair, the fight draining out of her. The harvest was bad 2 years in a row. Then the tractor broke. I took a loan to fix the roof. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Because you have your own lives." Elsie cried, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't want to be a burden. I wanted to handle it." David threw the letter onto the table. It slid across the wood, stopping right where Walter's plate had been. "Well, you haven't handled it, Mom. You're drowning. And instead of asking for help, you're playing house with a hobo and pretending everything is fine." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This settles it. You can't keep the farm. You physically can't run it and you financially can't afford it. We have to sell. If we list it now, maybe we can beat the foreclosure auction and you can walk away with a little equity. Enough to get a condo in the city near us." "I am not selling this farm," Elsie said, but her voice was weak. "Frank built this place." "Frank is dead, Mom," David shouted. "And the farm is dead too. It's over. You need to let go." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of tears and circular arguments. By the time David and Sarah left, the sun had gone down, taking all the warmth of the day with it. David's parting words were an ultimatum. "I'm calling the real estate agent on Monday. And that man better be gone by the time I come back next weekend, or I'm bringing the police." Elsie stood on the porch, watching their taillights fade into the darkness. She felt hollowed out. The secret she had carried for months, the crushing weight of the debt, was out and it felt like a physical blow. She wrapped her shawl tighter and looked toward the barn. She needed to apologize to Walter. She needed to tell him that David didn't speak for her. She walked across the frozen ground, the wind biting at her tear-streaked face. She slid the barn door open. The lantern was dim. Walter was sitting on an overturned bucket near the puppies, his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered. His expression wasn't angry. It was filled with a profound, aching sadness. "I'm so sorry, Walter," Elsie began, stepping into the warmth of the straw. "David, he doesn't understand. He's just protective." Walter looked at her and she realized he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the piece of paper in his hand. Elsie froze. It was one of the red-stamped envelopes. It must have fallen out of David's pocket or blown out the door when he stormed out. 60 days, Walter said softly. He didn't ask a question. He just stated the fact. "Walter, Elsie started, shame flooding her face hot and fast. "You're in as much trouble as I am, Elsie," he said, standing up slowly. He handed her the paper. "Your son is right about one thing. You can't run this place alone. And you can't pay this back with corn and good intentions." Elsie took the paper, her hand trembling. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the first time she had said the words aloud. "I'm going to lose it all." Walter looked at the puppies, then back at the tractor he had fixed, and finally at her. A strange resolve hardened his features, clearing the sadness from his eyes. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. "You're not. I lost my farm because I was too proud to fight for it. I won't watch you lose yours." He walked over to the workbench and picked up a rusted metal box Elsie hadn't seen in years. It was Frank's old seed logbook. "I've been looking at your soil charts," Walter said, opening the book. "And I've been looking at the market forecast. Your son sees a dead farm. I see a mistake you've been making for 3 years." He tapped the page with a dirty finger. "You're planting the wrong crop, Elsie. And I know how to fix it. But we have to move fast." Elsie stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about $18,000, Walter said. "And I'm talking about the one secret I haven't told you yet." He stepped closer into the circle of lantern light. "I wasn't just a farmer, Elsie. Before the whiskey and the grief took me, I was one of the best agricultural consultants in the Midwest. And if you trust me, if you really trust me, we aren't going to sell this farm. We're going to save it." Elsie looked at the fire in his eyes, a spark of dangerous hope catching in her chest. But before she could answer, a sudden booming sound echoed from the darkness of the main road, a siren cutting through the night, getting louder and closer, heading straight for her driveway. Walter's face went white. He knew that sound. And he knew who David had called. The siren that had cut through the night eventually faded, a mournful wail dying out toward the highway. It hadn't turned up the drive, but the threat of it lingered in the air like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table was set for 2, but the chairs remained empty. The pot roast Elsie had salvaged from the disastrous lunch sat congealing on the stove, the fat turning white and hard. She watched the clock on the wall. 6:30. 7:15. Walter was punctual. He treated dinner like a shift change. Arrive on time, clean up, eat, nod, leave. His absence was a hole in the room. Elsie stood up, the chair scraping loud against the linoleum. She knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, why he wasn't there. She grabbed her shawl and the flashlight, ignoring the way her hands trembled. The walk to the barn felt longer than usual. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that amplified the sound of her own breathing. When she slid the barn door open, the warmth of the heater hit her, carrying the scent of straw and dogs, but the atmosphere was wrong. It felt temporary. Walter was there, but he wasn't sitting with the puppies. He was standing by the stall, his back to her. His battered canvas duffel bag, the one he had arrived with, sat open on a hay bale. He was folding his spare flannel shirt with agonizing precision, placing it inside. "You didn't come for dinner?" Elsie said, her voice small in the cavernous space. Walter didn't turn around. He placed a small tin of matches into the side pocket of the bag. "I'm not hungry, ma'am." "Don't call me that," she snapped, stepping further inside. "Not now. Why are you packing?" He finally turned. In the yellow light of the lantern, he looked decades older than he had that morning. The vitality that had returned to his face over the last few weeks had drained away, leaving the gray pallor of defeat. "You heard your son," Walter said, his voice flat. "He's right. I'm a liability. I won't be the wedge that drives a mother away from her children. You have enough trouble with the bank. You don't need a squatter making it worse. You are not a squatter, Elsie argued, closing the distance between them. You live here. You work here. And look where that got you. Walter gestured vaguely toward the house. Police threats. Family fights. Secrets exposed. He zipped the bag shut. The sound was final, like a judge's gavel. I'll head out toward the interstate. I can hitch a ride to the shelter in the city before the snow hits hard. I'll take the pups, or leave them if you think you can manage. He looked down at Gus and Gracie, who were watching him with confused, tilted heads. The thought of leaving them clearly tore at him. Stay, Elsie said. It came out as a whisper, then she found her voice. Stay. Please. Walter shook his head, slinging the bag over his shoulder. I can't, Elsie. I'm no good to you. You think I'm some sort of handyman saint because I fixed a fence? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me, she challenged, blocking his path to the door. Tell me what is so terrible that you think you deserve to freeze to death on a highway. Walter stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and his resolve seemed to crumble. He dropped the bag. It hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He limped over to the overturned bucket and sat down, his bad legs stretched out stiffly before him. He pulled the crumpled photograph from his pocket, the one Elsie had found weeks ago, and rubbed his thumb over the faces. Her name was Margaret, he began, his voice barely audible. We had 400 acres outside of Lincoln. Corn, soy, a little cattle. It was a good life. Hard but good. Elsie moved quietly to sit on a bale of hay opposite him, giving him space. She was the heart of it, Walter continued, staring into the past. I was the agricultural consultant. I knew the science of the soil, the pH balances, the yields. But Margaret, she knew the soul of the place. She could look at a sky and tell you when to plant. She made the house a home. He took a shaky breath. She got sick. Ovarian cancer. It was fast but not fast enough. Took everything. The savings, the insurance, the joy. He paused, swallowing hard. When she died, I stopped. I didn't care about the corn. Didn't care about the harvest. I found a bottle of whiskey in the cabinet, and I didn't put it down for 2 years. The barn was silent, save for the soft breathing of the dogs. I missed payments, Walter said, the shame vibrating in his tone. I missed meetings. I missed my daughter's wedding because I was too drunk to tie my tie. The bank took the farm. My daughter, Sarah, same name as yours, she tried to help. But I was mean when I drank. I said things, unforgivable things. He looked up at Elsie, his eyes wet. So I left. Or I was thrown out. I don't remember which anymore. I've been walking for 5 years. Trying to outrun the man who let his wife die and his legacy burn. He gestured helplessly around the barn. So you see? I couldn't save my own place. I couldn't save my family. What good am I to you? I'm just a ghost haunting another man's farm. Elsie sat with his words for a long moment. She understood the weight of them. She understood the seductive pull of giving up. Frank didn't just die, Elsie said softly. Walter looked up, startled by the shift. The accident, Elsie went on, picking at a loose thread on her shawl. Everyone said it was a freak thing. The brakes failed on the hill. But 2 days before, he asked me to check the hydraulic fluid. He was busy with the harvest, and he asked me to just check the levels. She looked at Walter, her eyes dry and burning. I forgot. I was busy baking pies for the church sale. I just forgot. And then on Tuesday the brakes failed. Elsie, Walter murmured. I don't know if that's why, she whispered. The mechanic said the lines were old, that it could have happened anyway. But I don't know. And every time I look at that tractor, I wonder if I killed him. She let out a shuddering breath. I pushed my children away because I couldn't bear them looking at me. I stayed in this house, freezing and starving because I felt like I deserved it. Like it was my penance. She looked at Walter. We are both haunting ourselves, Walter. You think you're running from your failure, and I'm sitting in the middle of mine. Walter looked at her with a new recognition. He saw the cracks in her armor mirroring the cracks in his own. Maybe neither of us can save ourselves, Elsie said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. Maybe that's the trick. We're too heavy to lift ourselves up. But maybe together we don't have to be. She stood up and walked over to his duffel bag. She picked it up. It was heavy with his guilt, his few possessions. She walked back to the stall and hung it on the hook, firmly. You aren't leaving, she stated. And we aren't selling the farm. You said you have a plan. You said you know how to fix the soil. Walter looked at the bag, then back at her. The soldier was coming back into his eyes, pushing out the drifter. I do. But it's risky. And it means changing everything Frank did. Frank is gone, Elsie said, letting the truth of it settle without the usual sting. And we are here. And we have 60 days. Walter slowly stood up. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He walked over to the workbench and picked up the seed logbook again. He opened it to a blank page, grabbed a pencil, and turned to Elsie. The soil in the south pasture is too acidic for corn, he said, his voice regaining that sharp, educated edge. That's why the yields are dropping. But that acidity, it's perfect for something else. Something that grows fast, sells high in the autumn markets, and doesn't need heavy machinery we don't have. What? Elsie asked, stepping closer to look at the page. Walter began to sketch. Lines, rows, numbers. Heirloom pumpkins. Not the carving kind. The specialty ones. Cinderella, Jarradale, Blue Hubbard. The restaurants in the city pay a premium for them. And winter squash. We have just enough time for a late-season rapid harvest if we prep the ground now. Pumpkins? Elsie asked, skeptical. It's the only way to make $18,000 in 2 months, Walter said. But we have to work. Harder than you've ever worked. Day and night. And we need seed money. I have a little, Elsie said. My burial fund. Walter stopped writing. He looked at her. You'd bet your funeral on a pumpkin patch? I'd rather die fighting for the land than waiting for the bank to take it, she replied. Walter held her gaze for a long second, and then, for the first time since he had arrived, a genuine smile touched his lips, small, tentative, but real. All right then, partner. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we tear up the cornfields. Elsie nodded and turned to the door. She felt a strange buzzing in her blood. Fear, yes, but also adrenaline. As she stepped out into the night, the farm didn't feel like a graveyard anymore. It felt like a battlefield. But as she reached the porch, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The wind had blown the mailbox open. Inside, illuminated by her flashlight, wasn't a letter. It was a dead crow, its neck snapped, with a note tied to its leg. Get him out or we burn him out. She stared at the darkness of the road, realizing that the bank wasn't the only enemy they were fighting, and that some people in this town, perhaps even her own blood, would stop at nothing to keep the past buried. Elsie burned the note in the kitchen sink. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the threat, get him out or we burn him out, turning to ash under the flame of a match. She washed the ash down the drain, her hands shaking, and made a choice. She wouldn't tell Walter. If he knew about the dead crow in the mailbox, about the violence simmering in the town's belly, he would leave to protect her. And right now, leaving was a death sentence for the farm. Instead, she walked out to the barn, her jaw set, ready to wage a different kind of war. Walter was already at the workbench, the seed logbook spread open like a battle map. The transformation from the broken man shivering in a blanket to the figure standing before her was startling. He held a pencil with authority, tapping a rhythm on the page. The soil is acidic, Walter said without preamble as she entered. He didn't look up. His mind was already 3 steps ahead. Frank was planting field corn. Feed corn. It's a nitrogen hog. It's been starving this land for 3 years, and the land has been fighting back with stunted yields. That's why you can't make the payments. Elsie moved to his side, looking at the complex grid he had drawn. So we fix the soil? That takes years, Walter. We have 60 days. We don't fix it. We use it, Walter corrected, turning to look at her. His eyes were sharp, the fog of grief replaced by the clarity of a scientist. Acidity isn't a death sentence, it's a preference. We rotate. Immediately. We rip out the remaining stubble and we plant winter-hardy, short-cycle cucurbits. Heirloom pumpkins. Gourds. The ugly ones. Ugly ones? Elsie asked. Jarradale blues. Warty goblins. Cinderella pumpkins. Walter listed them off like old friends. The commodity market is flooded with orange jack-o'-lanterns. They sell for pennies. But the specialty market? The city decorators, the high-end restaurants in the capital? They pay 10 times the price for the strange, beautiful ones. And they thrive in this soil. But the seeds, Elsie said. The distribution. I don't know those people. Walter hesitated. He looked at his hands, rough, scarred hands that had once shaken hands with state senators and agricultural board directors. I do, he said quietly. Or I did. There's a buyer in the city. An old contact. If I vouch for the crop, he'll take it. But we have to grow it first. The next 3 weeks were a blur of exhaustion that bordered on delirium. They worked from the moment the sky turned gray in the east until the moon was high and white overhead. Elsie had never seen anyone work like Walter. He wasn't just labor, he was an artist. He treated the tractor, which he had miraculously kept running with baling wire and prayer, like a finely tuned instrument. He showed her how to mix a slurry of compost and wood ash to side-dress the rows, how to read the leaves for signs of thirst before the soil even cracked. He didn't limp when he was in the field. It was as if the land itself absorbed his pain. Elsie worked beside him, her muscles screaming, her hands blistering and callousing over. They spoke little, but their silence was a woven thing, a fabric of shared purpose. There was no room for the awkwardness of strangers. They were soldiers in the same trench. Gus and Gracie, no longer tumbling balls of fluff but lanky, long-legged adolescents, fell into the rhythm too. Walter trained them to patrol the perimeter, keeping the deer and rabbits away from the tender shoots. They took their job with comical seriousness, their ears swiveling like radar dishes, sleeping in shifts at the barn door. The first trip into town came 2 weeks later. They needed supplies they couldn't scavenge, row covers and specific organic fertilizers Walter insisted on. Elsie drove the battered pickup. Walter rode shotgun, staring straight ahead, his hat pulled low. When they pulled up to the feed store, the conversation on the loading dock died instantly. 3 men Elsie had known since high school stopped talking, their eyes tracking Walter as he stepped out of the truck. The silence was heavy, loaded with judgment. "That's him," the eyes said. "The squatter. The bum." Elsie slammed her door, walking around the front of the truck to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. She didn't say a word to the men. She just walked toward the entrance. Inside, Mrs. Chen was behind the counter. She looked up, her expression unreadable behind her glasses. She looked at Elsie, then at Walter, who had removed his hat respectfully. "We need 10 bags of the potassium mix, Mrs. Chen," Elsie said, her voice challenging the room to object. Mrs. Chen paused. She looked past them, through the window where the men were still staring, then back at Elsie. A small, conspiratorial smile touched her lips. "I put some aside for you, Elsie," Mrs. Chen said. "And I've got some dented cans of high-protein dog food in the back. Can't sell them. Thought maybe those wolves of yours could use them." It was a small kindness, but in the hostile climate of the town, it felt like a lifeline. As they loaded the truck, Pastor Williams drove by. He slowed his sedan, rolled down the window, and tipped his head at Walter. "Fields looking distinct, Mr. Hargrove," the pastor called out. "Blue pumpkins. Haven't seen those since I was a boy in Vermont. Bold choice." "Fortune favors the bold, Reverend," Walter replied, his voice steady. "Indeed," the pastor said, glancing at the men on the dock before driving on. "Indeed. They're talking," Walter said as they drove back, the town fading in the rearview mirror. "I saw the way they looked at you, Elsie. They think you've lost your mind." "Let them talk," Elsie said, gripping the wheel. "Talking doesn't pay the mortgage. Pumpkins do." But the talk was dangerous. Elsie knew that. She had seen the way the clerk at the grocery store pulled her hand back quickly when giving change, as if Elsie were contagious. She heard the whispers of shacking up and senile. It hurt. She had lived here her whole life. But looking at Walter, who sat reviewing his notebook, calculating growth rates, she realized she cared less about their respect and more about his. The breakthrough happened in late November. The vines, nurtured by Walter's slurry and Elsie's sweat, had exploded. The fields were dotted not with orange, but with slate blue, deep sage green, and creamy white. They were strange, prehistoric-looking things. Walter made the call from the kitchen wall phone, his voice dropping into a cadence Elsie hadn't heard before, professional, confident, authoritative. He spoke to a distributor in the city, dropping names from a decade ago, navigating the conversation with a grace that revealed the man he used to be. He hung up, his hand resting on the receiver for a long moment. "Well?" Elsie asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Walter turned. "He remembers me. He remembers Margaret." He swallowed hard. "He's sending a truck on Thursday. He offered 20% above market rate if the quality is what I promised." Elsie let out a breath that turned into a laugh, a sound that surprised them both. "We did it. We grew them," Walter cautioned, though his eyes were shining. "Now we have to harvest them. 3 days, Elsie. We have to clear 4 acres in 3 days to meet the truck." The harvest was a fever dream. They worked by lantern light. They worked until their backs seized and their fingers were numb. But with every heavy, warty gourd they loaded onto the pallets in the barn, the crushing weight of the debt felt a little lighter. On the final night, the barn was full. Pallets of blue Hubbards and Cinderellas were stacked high, waiting for the truck. Elsie and Walter sat on the tailgate of the pickup, sharing a thermos of coffee. Gus and Gracie were asleep at their feet, exhausted. Elsie looked at Walter. He was dirty, tired, and smelling of sweat and earth. He was also the most solid thing in her life. You saved us, she said quietly. We aren't out of the woods yet, Walter said, looking at the checkbook Elsie had left on the dashboard. This shipment covers the back interest and about half the principal. It buys us time. It stops the foreclosure for now. It's enough, Elsie said. She reached out and covered his rough hand with hers. It's a start. Walter didn't pull away. He looked at their hands, then up at her face. The connection between them wasn't romantic. It was deeper than that. It was the bond of two people who had stood back to back against the world and won the first round. You know, Walter said softly, David is going to be furious that you pulled this off. He wanted you to sell. David can go to hell, Elsie said, and they both chuckled. It was a moment of perfect, fragile peace. The barn was full, the dogs were safe, and the farm was alive. Then the dog's head snapped up. A low growl started deep in Gus's throat. Elsie felt the hair on her arms stand up. She looked toward the driveway. There were no headlights, no sound of an engine, just the wind. What is it? She whispered. Walter slid off the tailgate, grabbing the pitchfork leaning against the wall. His movement was fluid, instant. Someone's on the property, he hissed. On foot. He moved toward the barn door, signaling Elsie to stay back. But before he could reach the opening, a bright flash illuminated the night, followed by a sound that stopped Elsie's heart, the distinct, crackling whoosh of gasoline catching fire. The drying shed. Walter shouted, breaking into a run. Elsie scrambled off the truck, her eyes widening in horror. Through the open barn door, she could see orange flames licking up the side of the wooden shed where they stored the diesel for the tractor, and the rest of the winter hay. The threat from the crow hadn't been a bluff. They weren't just trying to scare him out anymore. They were burning him out. And they didn't care if the whole farm went up with him. The smell of wet ash and charred wood clung to the farm like a second skin. They had saved the barn, Walter and Elsie fighting the flames with garden hoses and frantic desperation until the fire department finally arrived. But the drying shed was a blackened skeleton against the gray sky. The police had called it suspicious but inconclusive, a phrase that offered no protection. 2 days later, the second blow landed. It didn't come with fire, but with a briefcase. Mr. Donnelly from the bank sat at Elsie's kitchen table, refusing the coffee she offered. He was a thin man with eyes that constantly scanned the room, as if appraising the furniture for auction. The pumpkin payment covered the interest, Mrs. Whitaker, Donnelly said, sliding a document across the oilcloth. But the fire changes the risk assessment. The insurance company is jittery. The bank is jittery. He tapped the paper with a manicured fingernail. The grace period has been revoked. You have 30 days to clear the arrears on the principal. 30 days or we initiate foreclosure proceedings. Elsie stared at the date on the paper. 30 days? Mr. Donnelly, that's impossible. The winter markets are not our concern, he cut in smoothly. We advise you to consider listing the property voluntarily. It looks better on your credit report than an eviction. He left a silence in his wake that was colder than the draft from the window. Elsie sat there long after his car had crunched down the driveway, the document blurring under her gaze. The pressure didn't stay contained to the kitchen. It spilled out into the town, thick and suffocating. When Elsie and Walter set up their stand at the Saturday market, the atmosphere had shifted. The curiosity from the previous weeks had curdled into judgment. Their display was beautiful, rows of slate-blue Jarrahdale pumpkins and warty goblins that Walter had polished until they gleamed, but the customers were scarce. Elsie watched Mrs. Gable, a woman she had known for 40 years, walk purposefully toward them, then veer away at the last second when she saw Walter weighing a squash. She saw the whispers behind hands. She saw the way mothers pulled their children closer when they passed. They're afraid, Walter said quietly, not looking up from the ledger. They're fools, Elsie muttered, arranging the gourds with aggressive precision. Fear makes people foolish, he replied. And it makes them cruel. You shouldn't be seen with me, Elsie. I'll stand where I please, she snapped, though her heart felt like a stone in her chest. But the real cruelty arrived on Sunday afternoon. Elsie was in the kitchen peeling potatoes when she heard the car door slam. It was a sound she had learned to dread. She looked out to see David striding toward the house, but this time he wasn't alone. He was carrying a thick manila folder, and his face was twisted with a grim, triumphant fury. Walter was on the porch, mending a harness for the plow. He stood up as David approached, his posture shifting instantly into a defensive stance. Don't speak to him, David barked at Elsie as he stormed up the steps. He ignored Walter entirely, treating him like a piece of rotting furniture. I told you I'd do my homework, Mom. I told you I wouldn't let you be swindled. He threw the folder onto the porch table. Papers fanned out. Mugshots, police reports, court documents. Walter Hargrove. David read the name like a curse. Arrested in Lincoln, 2021. DUI. Arrested in Omaha, 2022. Public intoxication. Arrested in Des Moines, 2023. Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. David jabbed a finger at a photo of a younger, wilder-eyed Walter, his face bruised and swollen. This is who is sleeping in Dad's barn. A drunk. A criminal. A violent offender. Elsie looked at the papers. The mugshots were brutal. They showed a man in the depths of hell, eyes hollowed out by grief and whiskey. And here, David pulled out a final sheet. Foreclosure records. He didn't just lose his farm, Mom. He fought the bank, threatened the loan officer. He was forcibly removed by the sheriff. David turned to Elsie, his voice shaking. He is dangerous. He has a history of violence when things don't go his way. You have to choose, Mom. Right now. It's him or your family. If he isn't gone by tonight, I'm taking you to the city and I'm filing for power of attorney to sell this place before he burns it down with you inside. Elsie felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Walter. He stood perfectly still. He didn't look at the papers. He didn't look at David. He looked at her. Walter, she whispered. He's right, Walter said. His voice was low, stripped of all defense. See, David shouted. He admits it. I was all those things, Walter continued, his gaze never wavering from Elsie's. I was drunk for 2 years. I fought the sheriff because they were taking the only thing I had left of Margaret. I slept in alleys. I got into fights because I wanted someone to hurt me as much as I hurt inside. He took a step back, his hands open at his sides. I won't lie to you, Elsie. I won't lie about who I was. I brought shame on my name and I lost my family because of it. Then get out. David stepped forward, his chest puffing out. David, stop. Elsie cried. No, Mom. He's a liability. I'm leaving, Walter said softly. He looked at the barn, then at Gus and Gracie, who were watching from the doorway, sensing the tension. I won't be the reason you lose your son, Elsie. No, Elsie said. The word started small, then grew. No. She walked over to the table and gathered the papers. She looked at the mugshot, then up at the man standing before her. The man who had mucked stalls, saved puppies, fixed the tractor, and respected her grief when her own children had told her to move on. You were those things, Walter, Elsie said firmly. But you aren't them now. Mom, are you insane? David grabbed her arm. He's brainwashed you. Let go of me, Elsie yanked her arm back. He didn't brainwash me. He helped me. He saved the harvest. He respects this land. He's a criminal, and you're a stranger. Elsie shouted, the truth of it finally bursting out. You come here once a month to criticize the paint and check the inheritance. Walter is here every day. He knows the names of the dogs. He knows which fence post is rotting. He is more family to this farm than you have been in 10 years. David recoiled as if slapped. Fine, if that's how you want it. But don't expect me to visit you in the hospital when he snaps. There's a town meeting tonight, David sneered, backing away. About the vagrant issue. I put it on the agenda. The whole town is going to know exactly who you're harboring. Let's see how brave you are then. He drove off in a spray of gravel. The town meeting was held in the high school gymnasium. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly pallor over the crowd. It seemed half the town was there. Mrs. Chin, Pastor Williams, the men from the feed store, and David, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed. Elsie walked in with Walter beside her. He had tried to stay behind, but she had refused. If we go down standing up, she had told him. The air in the room was thick with hostility. When the moderator opened the floor to new business, David stood up. He didn't shout. He spoke with the calm, reasoned tone of a concerned citizen. He laid out the facts of Walter's past, the arrests, the drinking. He painted a picture of a predator taking advantage of a lonely widow. We can't have people like this in our community, David concluded, looking at the crowd. We need to protect our vulnerable. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the bleachers. It's not safe, someone whispered. He's trouble, another said. The moderator looked at Elsie. Mrs. Whitaker? Do you have anything to say? Elsie stood up. Her knees were shaking, but she gripped the back of the chair in front of her until her knuckles turned white. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, people she had baked pies for, people she had sat next to in church. You all know me, Elsie began, her voice trembling slightly. You knew Frank. You know I don't take in strays lightly. She looked at David, then at Walter, who sat with his head bowed, accepting the judgment as his due. "My son told you about Walter's worst days," Elsie said, her voice gaining strength. "He told you about the man who broke under the weight of grief. But he didn't tell you about the man who walked 10 miles in a storm to save 2 puppies. He didn't tell you about the man who works from dawn till dusk to save a farm that isn't his, asking for nothing but a bowl of soup and a roof." The room went quiet. "We all have seasons we aren't proud of," Elsie continued, scanning the crowd. "I see faces here who have struggled with the bottle. I see faces who have lost their tempers. The difference is Walter owns his sins. He carries them. And he gets up every morning trying to be better than he was the day before." She reached down and took Walter's hand, pulling him to stand beside her. He looked at her with awe, as if she were shielding him from a firing squad. "He's a better man now than most people on their best day," Elsie declared, her voice ringing off the rafters. "He is not a vagrant. He is my partner. And if you want to run him out, you'll have to run me out too." She sat down. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Then slowly Mrs. Chin started to clap. It was a single lonely sound. Then Pastor Williams joined in. Then the mechanic who had seen Walter fix the tractor. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was there, a ripple of begrudging respect. David stormed out of the gym. Elsie and Walter drove home in silence, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The bank still needed $18,000 in 30 days. As they pulled into the driveway, the headlights cut through the darkness. Walter leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "Elsie," he said, his voice sharp with warning. "Stop the truck." "What is it?" "The sky," he pointed to the west. "Look at the sky." Elsie looked. There were no stars. The horizon wasn't black. It was a bruised, sickly green. The air pressure dropped so suddenly her ears popped. "It's not just a storm," Walter said, throwing the door open. "It's a freeze. A killing freeze. If we don't cover the rest of those pumpkins tonight, the bank won't have to foreclose. The crop will be dead by morning." He looked at her, the exhaustion of the day forgotten. "We have 4 acres exposed," he said. "And maybe 6 hours." The temperature didn't just drop. It plummeted as if the earth itself had stopped breathing. The bruised green sky that Walter had pointed to earlier curdled into a violent, churning gray, and the wind began to scream across the open fields, carrying needles of ice that stung exposed skin like glass. "Faster!" Walter yelled over the gale. His voice was ragged, shredded by the cold and the exertion. He was dragging a heavy canvas tarp across the rows of prize winner pumpkins, his bad leg buckling with every step. They had been working for 4 hours straight. The adrenaline that had fueled them after the town meeting had long since burned off, replaced by a grueling, mechanical desperation. Elsie was 2 rows over, wrestling with a sheet of agricultural plastic that snapped and whipped in the wind like a living thing. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves, her face raw. "Walter, stop!" she screamed, seeing him stumble. "It's too much. We can't cover them all. We lose the crop, we lose the farm." Walter roared back, not stopping. He grabbed another rock to weigh down the corner of the tarp. "Keep going, Elsie. Just the prize rows. Save the big ones." He was moving with a manic intensity that terrified her. He wasn't just fighting the weather. He was fighting the bank, the town, his past, and the ghost of the failure that had cost him his family. He was throwing his aging body against the elements as if he could hold back the freeze by sheer force of will. The wind howled louder, knocking over a stack of empty crates. Gus and Gracie were barking frantically from inside the barn, sensing the chaos. Elsie watched Walter grab a roll of burlap. He hoisted it onto his shoulder, a weight a man half his age would struggle with. He took 2 steps, his boots slipping on the freezing mud. "Walter." He didn't answer. He took another step, and then, without a sound, he simply crumpled. It wasn't a trip or a stumble. It was a collapse, like a building whose foundation had finally given way. He hit the frozen earth hard and didn't move. "Walter." Elsie dropped the plastic and ran, stumbling over the uneven furrows. She fell to her knees beside him, ripping the gloves off her hands to touch his face. His skin was clammy and gray, cold sweat freezing on his forehead. His eyes were half open, glazed and unfocused. He was clutching his chest, his breath coming in shallow, terrifying rasps. "Walter, look at me," Elsie pleaded, slapping his cheek lightly. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave me here alone." He tried to speak, his lips blue. The blues," he wheezed. "Cover the blues. Forget the damn pumpkins." Elsie cried. She fumbled for her phone, her frozen fingers barely able to unlock the screen. She didn't call 911. The ambulance would take 30 minutes to reach this far out. She dialed the only person she knew would answer. "Pastor," she screamed into the phone as soon as the line clicked. "It's Walter. The field. I think it's his heart." The next 20 minutes were a blur of terror. Elsie draped her own coat over Walter, shielding him from the wind with her body, whispering prayers she hadn't said since Frank died. When the headlights of Pastor Williams' sedan finally cut through the darkness, cutting across the field right up to where they lay, Elsie sobbed with relief. They loaded Walter into the back seat. He was dead weight now, barely conscious. The pastor drove like a man possessed, the sedan skidding on the icing roads as they raced toward the county hospital. The emergency room was a stark, fluorescent shock after the darkness of the storm. The doctors swarmed Walter, shouting codes and vitals, cutting open the flannel shirt Elsie had washed for him just yesterday. They wheeled him behind double doors, leaving Elsie standing in the hallway, covered in mud, smelling of freezing rain and fear. Pastor Williams put a hand on her shoulder. "Sit down, Elsie. He's a fighter." "He worked himself to death," Elsie whispered, sinking into a plastic chair. "For me. He did it for me." Time lost its meaning. The storm raged outside the hospital windows, rattling the glass. Elsie stared at the clock, watching the minutes tick away. Every minute was another degree dropping in the fields. Every minute was the frost sinking deeper into the flesh of the pumpkins that were supposed to save them. Hours later, or maybe days, footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. Fast, purposeful footsteps. Elsie looked up, expecting the doctor. Instead, she saw David. He looked tired, his coat wet from the snow. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a woman Elsie had never seen, but instantly recognized. She had the same steel-gray eyes as Walter, the same set of the jaw. She was in her 30s, dressed in nursing scrubs covered by a parka, looking like she had been pulled straight from a shift. It was the little girl from the photograph. "David?" Elsie stood up, confused. "I didn't do this for you," David said, his voice tight. He gestured to the woman. "I tracked her down 2 days ago. After I found the arrest records. I thought she should know where he was before the police got involved." The woman stepped forward. She stopped a few feet from Elsie, her expression a war between anger and exhaustion. "I'm Margaret," she said. Her voice was hard. "David said my father is here. He said he had a heart attack." "He collapsed," Elsie said, feeling suddenly protective of the man inside. "He was saving my farm. He's in stable condition, but they're running tests." Margaret let out a short, bitter laugh. "Saving a farm. Of course he was. He always cared more about the dirt than the people standing on it." "That's not fair," Elsie said. "He loves you. He carries your picture in his pocket. It's the only thing of value he owns." Margaret's face softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. "He lost the right to love me when he chose the bottle over my mother's memory. I haven't seen him in 6 years. I didn't even know if he was alive until your son called." Just then the doctor emerged from the double doors. He looked weary. "Family of Walter Hargrove?" "I'm his daughter," Margaret said, stepping forward before Elsie could. "He's awake," the doctor said. "It wasn't a massive heart attack, but it was a severe angina episode brought on by extreme physical exhaustion and hypothermia. His heart is weak. He needs rest. Absolute rest. Or the next one will kill him." "Can I see him?" Margaret asked. Briefly. Margaret looked at Elsie, then at David. "I'll go in alone." Elsie sat back down, the exclusion stinging. But she understood. This was a reckoning that had been waiting for years. Inside the room, the machines beeped in a rhythmic, sterile cadence. Walter lay pale against the white sheets, tubes running into his arm. He looked small, fragile. When Margaret walked in, he turned his head. His eyes widened, and he tried to sit up, setting off a flurry of alarms on the monitor. "Maggie," he rasped. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice trembling. She stood at the foot of the bed, gripping the rail. "You look terrible, Dad." "I am terrible," Walter whispered. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, tracking into his ears. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "David called me," she said. "He told me you were scamming his mother." "I'm not," Walter said, the urgency bleeding into his voice. "I'm helping her. I'm trying. I'm trying to fix something. I couldn't save our place, Maggie. I couldn't save Mom. But I thought maybe, if I could save this." "It's not your farm, Dad." Margaret snapped, the tears finally spilling over. You can't redeem yourself by fixing someone else's fence. You left me. You left me alone to deal with the bank and the auction and the shame. I know, Walter sobbed. I know. And, I'm sorry isn't enough. It'll never be enough. I was a coward and a drunk. But I'm sober now. I have been for 3 years. I'm trying to be someone you could forgive. Even if you never do. Margaret stared at him. She saw the lines in his face, the rough, scarred hands that used to hold hers when they walked the cornfields. She saw a man who had been broken and put back together wrong, but who was still trying to stand. I don't know if I can forgive you, she whispered. But, I'm glad you're not dead. Out in the hallway, Elsie watched the clock. Midnight. The storm outside was breaking, but the damage was done. She walked to the window and looked out into the black night. Walter was down. The doctor said he couldn't work. Margaret was in there, a variable Elsie couldn't predict. David was standing by the exit, looking vindicated and impatient. And back at the farm, 4 acres of premium heirloom pumpkins sat under a killing frost, half covered by a man who had nearly died trying to protect them. Elsie checked her phone. No messages. The bank payment, $18,000, was due in 72 hours. She was going to lose the farm. It seemed inevitable now. But as she turned from the window, she saw Pastor Williams talking to David, shaking his head. You don't understand, son, the pastor was saying. It's not just about the money anymore. It's about the soul of this valley. Elsie grabbed her purse. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't do anything for Walter right now. But there was one thing she could do. She walked past David, past the pastor, and headed for the automatic doors. Mom? Where are you going? David called out. To finish the job, Elsie said, stepping out into the freezing night. She didn't know how she would cover 2 acres alone in the dark. She didn't know if the crop was already dead. But as she drove the truck back toward the farm, the headlights illuminated something strange on the road ahead. It wasn't snow. It was a line of trucks, pickups, sedans, a tractor. They were turning into her driveway. Elsie slowed down, her heart hammering. Had the bank come early? Was it the people who burned the shed coming to finish the job? She pulled up to the gate, terrified of what she would find. But as she looked toward the fields, she didn't see fire. She saw flashlights. Dozens of them. Bobbing in the darkness like fireflies in a graveyard. Elsie slammed the truck door and ran toward the lights, her boots slipping on the icy gravel. The wind was still biting, but the scene before her warmed the air better than any fire. It wasn't an invasion. It was a rescue party. Dozens of figures were moving through the pumpkin rows. Flashlights cut through the sleet, illuminating a chaotic but determined ballet of labor. People were shouting instructions, lifting the heavy gourds and passing them down human chains toward the waiting trucks. Mrs. Chin? Elsie gasped, stopping at the edge of the field. The feed store owner was wrapped in 3 layers of wool, her glasses fogged up. She was holding a tarp down while a teenage boy shoveled dirt onto the edges. Don't just stand there, Elsie, she yelled over the wind. Grab a corner. The frost is setting in fast. Elsie looked around, stunned. There was the mechanic from the garage. There was the librarian. There was the young boy who lived 3 miles down the road, the one who struggled in school. Even the men who had stared at them on the loading dock were there, heaving crates with silent efficiency. Why? Elsie asked, her voice cracking. Why are you all here? A man stepped out of the shadows. It was the mechanic, wiping grease and mud from his forehead. Walter came by the shop 3 weeks ago, he said, breathless. Saw I was struggling with my orchard. Showed me how to graft the branches to save the old trees. Didn't ask for a dime. Just said, trees need patience, son. He helped me with my 4-H pig, the teenage boy chimed in. I was gonna quit. He showed me how to handle him gentle-like. He fixed the church furnace, Mrs. Chin added, quietly, without telling a soul. Elsie felt the tears freeze on her cheeks. Walter hadn't just been hiding in her barn. He had been weaving himself into the fabric of the town, stitching up the loose ends he found, all while carrying the weight of his own brokenness. He hadn't told her any of it. He's a good man, Elsie, Pastor Williams said, appearing beside her with a crate of blue hubbats. And this town might be slow to trust, but we know how to pay a debt. Now let's get this crop in before the freeze takes it. Elsie didn't argue. She threw herself into the work. Half an hour later, headlights swept across the field again. David's silver sedan pulled up. He stepped out, looking bewildered. He had come to drag his mother away from a disaster, but instead, he found a miracle. He watched the vagrants' army saving his father's farm. He watched his mother laughing and crying as she worked alongside them. He stood there for a long time, the judgment draining out of his posture, replaced by a quiet, shameful realization. Finally, he took off his expensive city coat, rolled up his sleeves, and walked into the mud to lift a crate. By dawn, the fields were bare. The barn was packed floor to rafter with thousands of pounds of specialty pumpkins, safe and dry. The check that arrived from the city distributor 3 days later didn't just cover the $18,000. It covered the next 6 months of operating costs. Walter came home a week later. He was thinner, his movements slower, but the gray pallor was gone. Margaret drove him. She helped him out of the car, her hand hovering protectively near his elbow. She hadn't left for the city. She had stayed at the farmhouse, sleeping in Elsie's guest room, visiting the hospital every day. They walked him not to the barn but to the front porch. "The doctor says you can't be in the cold," Elsie said, standing at the door. "And the barn is drafty." "I'll be fine with an extra blanket," Walter argued weakly, though his eyes were on the dogs, who were whining and wiggling with joy at his feet. "You're not sleeping in the barn, Walter," Elsie said firmly. "I cleared out the sewing room downstairs. It has a bed. It has heat. And it has a door that locks if you want privacy." Walter stopped. He looked at the barn, his sanctuary, his purgatory, and then at the warm, open door of the farmhouse. He looked at Margaret, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "I don't want to intrude," he whispered. "Family doesn't intrude," Elsie said. Thanksgiving arrived with a golden, crisp clarity that redeemed the violence of the storm. The dining room table, fully extended with all the leaves, groaned under the weight of the feast. It was a strange, beautiful mosaic of people. David and Sarah were there, subdued and respectful. Margaret sat next to Walter, cutting his turkey for him when his hand trembled, a silent act of grace that made Walter's eyes shine. Gus and Gracie were under the table, resting their heads on heavy boots. The tension that had suffocated the house for years was gone, replaced by the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation. David cleared his throat halfway through the meal. The table went quiet. "I wanted to propose a toast," he said, standing up. He held his wine glass, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at Walter. "I judged a book by its cover. And I judged a man by his worst chapter. I was wrong. You saved this farm, Walter. And you saved my mom." Walter looked down, embarrassed. "We saved it together, son." "To the harvest," David said, raising his glass. "To the harvest," the table echoed. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the family had dispersed to the living room, Elsie found Walter on the porch. He was sitting in the rocker, wrapped in a quilt, watching the snow begin to fall on the healed fields. Elsie sat in the chair beside him. They rocked in silence for a while, the rhythm familiar and comforting. "You know," Walter said softly, "Margaret asked me to come stay with her in the city for a while. To be near her doctors. To get to know my grandkids." Elsie's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, that's wonderful, Walter." "I told her no," he said. Elsie turned to him. "Why?" "Because my work isn't done here," he replied. "The soil needs prepping for the spring cover crop. And those apple trees need pruning in February. And—" He turned to look at her, his eyes warm and clear. "And I finally found a place where I can sleep without nightmares." "I'm glad," Elsie whispered. "I asked for a barn," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came here with nothing but shame and 2 dying dogs. You gave me back my life, Elsie." Elsie smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "Funny," she said. "I thought you gave me mine." They sat there as the snow covered the world in white, 2 survivors who had found a way to bloom in the winter. The farm was safe. The family was whole. But as Elsie looked out toward the darkened tree line, her smile faded slightly. The peace felt earned, yes, but fragile. "Walter," she said, squinting into the dark, "did you ever find out who started the fire in the shed?" "Kids," Walter said dismissively. "Teenagers causing trouble." "Maybe," Elsie said. She didn't tell him about the crow in the mailbox. She didn't tell him about the feeling she had, a prickling on the back of her neck, that the anger in the town hadn't completely vanished, just gone underground. And then she saw it. A single, distinct flash of orange light from the deep woods bordering the north property line. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the flare of a match. Elsie stood up, her hand tightening on the railing. "Elsie?" Walter asked. "What is it?" "Nothing," she lied, her heart starting to hammer again. "Just thought I saw a deer." But as she stared into the darkness, the phone inside the house began to ring. It was late. Too late for a social call. Elsie walked inside and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" There was no voice on the other end. just the crackle of static, and then a sound that chilled her blood, the slow, rhythmic whistling of a tune she hadn't heard in years. It was the lullaby she used to sing to David. "Who is this?" she demanded. "Don't get too comfortable, Elsie," a distorted voice whispered. "The bank was the easy part. You think you know Walter? You think you know what he really ran from in Nebraska? Ask him about the fire that took his wife. Ask him why the police there never closed the case." The line went dead. Elsie stood in the warm hallway, the receiver trembling in her hand, looking through the glass at Walter rocking peacefully on the porch. The harvest was home, but the past, it seemed, had just arrived at the gate. Imagine if Elsie had looked at those freezing puppies and said, "Not my problem. That's what you're doing if you leave without engaging." Gus and Gracie survived because someone cared enough to act. Show us you're not the kind of person who turns their back on a happy ending. Hit that subscribe button, like the video for Gus and Gracie, and comment your favorite part of the story. Don't let the fire go out.